Hey, how's it going?
Good. I am Will Wilkinson, and you are Nate Powell, author of, I'm holding your book up to the camera, Swallow Me Whole, a graphic novel that has won a number of awards. Tell us what awards you won. You won the Eisner for what category?
Well, I wound up winning it for Best New Graphic Novel of 2009. So It was a surprise, and I was very, very flattered by that. It won an Ignatz Award for the Outstanding Debut of that year and for Outstanding Artist, and then it was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize.
Excellent. Well, that's well-lettered, well-world book. Tell me about I've just been getting back into comics after sort of years away from it, and there's a lot of these comics world things that aren't familiar to a lot of people. So like the Eisners, or is that kind of like it's kind of like the Oscars of comics, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically it is the Oscars of comics. Yeah, it's named after the comics mastermind Will Eisner, who came to prominence in the 40s and 50s and ended up teaching at the School of Visual Arts and debatably invented the graphic novel as a form in the 70s.
Yeah, outstanding. And then the awards, there is also the Ignatz Awards and the Harveys. They're kind of like the Golden Globes and the
and the daytime Tonys or whatever.
yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff you can win. But this graphic novel came out in 2009. Won all of these awards, and it's one of my favorite books that I've read in the last year or so. When I've been trying to catch up in the last 20 years of graphic novels, it's one of my favorites. Since I thought it'd be cool to talk to you. So Swallow Me Whole. Let's talk about it a little bit. It's I'm holding up the cover. There's the main character, Ruth, floating, trailed by a bunch of cicadas. Can you? It's a somewhat surreal story, but can you give us a synopsis?
Yeah, sure. Basically, Swallow Me Whole follows these two teenage step-siblings. They're growing up in the South. They have a terminally ill grandma who moves back in the house with them. And at a certain point, the step-siblings start to show different symptoms of different mental disorders. The bulk of the book, though, really is more about their cultural climate, their relationships with their family and the people around them, and their relationship with each other as, they're both trying to make sense of what's going on in the world around them, but they're also kind of moving in different directions.
Yeah, excellent. Now, what are the things that, you mentioned that they're both of the, what's the boy brother's name? Perry, is that it?
Perry, yeah.
Yeah, so they both have symptoms of, what would you say, different mental disorders? Like, how are they different? Like, what are we seeing?
Well, basically, Ruth has a lot of symptoms which are pretty common with obsessive compulsive disorder, but there is sort of there's an overarching or an underlying cosmic order that she feels like she's on the verge of being tapped into. And as this starts to ingrain itself a little more firmly in her mind, and as it carries with it a little more, substantial, almost religious weight, she definitely borders on, having those symptoms being a little more symptomatic of somebody with schizophrenia or with, at least emerging schizophrenic tendencies. And Perry basically has a delusion that there is this very small little wizard who basically shows up on the end of his writing utensils and commands him to write and draw certain things. And that's pretty much all he has going on. That's closer just to a schizophrenic.
Showing a picture of Perry's pencil wizard. So one of the things that I love so much about the book is how you, and there's something about the medium that really makes it amenable to depicting mental illness, where it's actually hard to write about because a lot of the symptoms are sensory. They're like auditory or visual hallucinations, and I think you do a great job of depicting that and making that feel real for me in a way that generally I don't feel so attached to it in just a novel or something like that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think comics have a couple of moments in which they are able to have a much nicer synthesis of visual information and content within the writing. And I think, yeah, I agree, because the experiences that the two main characters are having were highly subjective and highly based on the sights and sounds that they were perceiving. It was sort of predisposed to be a comic experience.
Yeah, I would ask you what the ending actually is, but I don't want to spoil it for anyone because it ends in a kind of somewhat surreal climax, which is hard. It's hard for the reader at that point to distinguish between reality
right.
and unreality. That they just sort of blend together in a way that I found very powerful and moving. So I encourage everyone to pick it up. Now, how long did it take you to? And this is one of those questions that you probably get asked a lot. Is how long does it take to produce a book like Swallow Me Whole?
Well, the real nuts and bolts of the book, it's about 200 pages. The actual time at the drawing table took about 2.5 years, and that's while I was working a full-time job and basically trying to draw it full-time, but really probably putting in 15, 20 hours a week maybe on it. The impetus of the book came from a dream I had in the fall of 2001, and basically I spent a couple of years sort of trying to whittle that into a functional narrative, and then another book I was doing sort of I got to a point where I realized these two stories were actually the same book, and I was finishing some other things up, and I tried to really get down to work twice maybe on the book, and it fizzled out. And then I spent a year just sharpening the writing itself. So all in all, really, there were 4 years of prep work. And once it got to a point where, it finally crystallized enough that it was time to sit down and do it, it took about 2.5 years.
Wow, but you said you were working a full-time job, and so you were kind of doing this between. So how long is it? So this is doing a graphic novel is a big production process. That there's a lot of different things you have to know how to do. I mean, you have to write a script. You have to lay out all the pages. You have to do the drawing. You have to ink the drawings. You got to letter it. How do you ever develop all of those skills? Where did you learn how to make comics? Because you as far as I can see, you've got the whole sort of set of skills, pretty nailed. How long do you think it really took you to get the comprehensive art of making comics down?
Well, I started drawing comics right around the time I turned 12, and I hadn't really seen, I hadn't gotten much of an inside glimpse as far as the work ethic or the practices or even the proper tools that the cartoonists I looked up to were using. Mm-hmm. But about 2 years after I started drawing comics with my best friend, he and I started publishing them. So we decided to go ahead and make our, I made 100 copies of each book, but we were making it bi-monthly. It's a 30-page book. So before we had a lot of the proper tools for constructing the narrative and for properly drawing a page with the right tools, we were already, shaping a work ethic which would allow us to push from beginning to end in the space of 2 months. And eventually I just started doing comics on my own, and learning more about the ins and outs of publishing at least on a copier, and at least figuring out what worked with layout and how to get things distributed in an underground fashion. Then I wound up going to school in New York City for cartooning at School of Visual Arts. And really, that, like, in the years before that, I was able to, read a couple of interviews with comic book artists, or I saw a couple of, pictorial features that showed the tools of the trade. But it wasn't until I was in art school that I really learned a little bit more about paying attention to what I was doing. But I still didn't spend enough time on really focusing on the writing element and seeing it as, 50% of the production. So I was doing tons of comics, and I was publishing them. They were getting around, but a lot of them were extremely intuitive. So much so that I feel like my work's become a lot more focused in the years since, and I feel like I'm like, I wish I still had that, basically that unlearned intuitive narrative sense. But really, that's just a kind way of saying, stuff just really doesn't make a lot of sense when you're reading this comic.
What do you mean by intuitive? You just mean it's sort of free associative, or
it's a lot of it is free associative. It's basically one of those. By intuitive, I simply mean if you are able to really get in, quote, the zone when you're reading some of these stories. And the other really good examples are there's a cartoonist named Farrell Dalrymple, who's a friend of mine, and in his books, as well as maybe Gas Shaw's would be a good example. If you're able to step fully inside the realm of the narrative, things do make sense. If you're able to accept content and characters and changes as they occur, it makes sense. It's a lot like a Haruki Murakami book, almost. That's what I mean by that intuitive sensibility.
Okay.
However, it also means that you're really not paying attention to the fact that someone is going to be reading and processing the things that you're making.
Yes. So I'm trying to get examples from your from your earlier output. So I happen to have your It Disappears that was published a few years ago by Soft Skull. It's a nice little book, and I loved this, but it also just completely baffled me.
Oh, baffles me too.
So it is like you feel like you're in a dream, and so and there's a kind of dream logic. There's funny animals who talk that you don't know if they're there or whether this guy's hallucinating them. There's just like a real you feel like you're in a kind of dream landscape. But like what you're saying, if there's a coherence to the internal world, somehow you can get absorbed in it, even if you can't make sense of it, and that's how I felt reading It Disappears.
Yeah, It Disappears is a good example of that. Another thing that sort of complicates the matter is, it's a simple issue of being afraid to say the things that you want to say, or feeling like they're not valid or whatever. And up until a certain point, you're not really aware or critical enough of what you're thinking, what you're communicating. So you get a lot of raw stuff, and that's where I get a lot of the extremely intuitive, dream logic fueled comics that also had a lot of content, but it wasn't all hitting at the same time. It Disappears. I did that during 2003, and I was living in Providence, Rhode Island at the time, and pretty much that stands as a good document of what happens where, and I was about 24 years old at the time, so it was this point where I was really into questioning everything, every part of my life, but a lot of that had to do with also feeling like, in addressing issues of, addressing issues of cultural or social privilege, addressing the role of, an artist in the world, especially when I was still working a day job and just doing regular stuff, and friends around me were doing things, and the war in Iraq was getting launched, and neighborhoods were changing in the city where I was living. That book sort of documents just a period of really being afraid to come out and just communicate something clearly and plainly. So there's a lot of stuff in that book where you have like these quasi-imaginary talking animals who are communicating about real life problems, but they're talking about it in a way where they're addressing, their awareness of the fact that they're a literary convention, or that people know what the role of a talking animal is in the story. And basically, it was almost this sort of solipsistic period where I was afraid to just come out and say anything plain. So I was just kind of like, dilly-dallying around a bunch of different narrative methods. So once I left Providence, thank God, and moved here to Bloomington, Indiana about 7 years ago, things got a little more plain, felt a little more comfortable in my own skin. I got refocused on things that were important to me. I stopped drawing comics for a year and just read, maybe a book a week, and really tried to focus on telling a clear story. And then it started to come together a lot more nicely.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of difficulty of unifying these different, strands of making comics, because so when I was growing up as a comics fan, what I learned about making comics, I got out of how to draw comics the Marvel way,
right?
And it kind
so
of
did we all.
It teaches you this classic production line, division of labor model of making comics. One guy writes a script, another guy does the pencils, another guy does the inks, another guy does the coloring, another guy does the lettering, and then that's that there's something really sensible about that model if you're trying to put out a comic every 2 weeks or every month or something like that. You need a lot of people working to meet a production schedule that fast. But then that also just allows people to specialize in one thing and do it really, really well. As I've been doing this big survey over the last several months of all the graphic novels I missed in the last 10 years when I stopped paying attention to comics, the thing that keeps striking me is that there are people who do who are really good writers, but maybe not the best, cartoonists, or people who are just really phenomenal artists who you're not sure if they have a lot to say, and so I guess one of the things that's been really been hitting me as I've been so here I'm in Iowa City, Iowa, where the Iowa Writers Workshop is, and my fiance is in the nonfiction writing program, and I'm surrounded by just terrific young writers and go to readings all the time. And I don't feel like most comics that the level of writing is what it could be. Now, do you think that that's just part of the constraints of it being so hard to specialize in, 3 things at once? Or just that people who are inclined to make comics are more visually focused and put less work into into the production of the story?
I'd say this is it's more the latter, myself included, certainly. And a lot of that is simply because folks who are both from my generation and the previous generation of cartoonists, by that I mean, instead of, I'm somebody who started publishing comics on a more broad scale about 10 years ago, so I mean people who started publishing 20 years ago on a more broad scale. But as far as these last 20 years of cartoonists, not only the market of comics has expanded, but the notion of what somebody can just sit down and do with a comic has changed and opened up enough, to let a lot more writer-artists come in and have their voices heard. But I think most of us are still very frustrated with our own, with being caught in a situation where we're all very aware that for most folks, the visual sensibilities and visual skill does come before writing. At least if you're just talking about in a technical sense, or talking about just really bringing home the bacon or whatever in an easy and clear way. So the good thing is I feel like in the last 5 years or so, we finally hit a point where, the independent comics market has exploded in the last 10 years. It's been really great. It's made a lot of room for a lot more experimental comics, thanks to like a lot of the Fort Thunder people, and a lot of people from like the Kramer's Ergot anthology series, some of which are the same people. There's been a lot of exposure on the more experimental side, and those books have done quite well, and in fact an entire niche has really solidified.
Can you give us a couple examples of some of those books?
Oh, sure. I mean, one of my favorites is this guy who goes by the name CF. He lives in Providence, and he does a book called Power Masters. And I think the 3rd issue will be out soon. There's also Brian Chippendale, also Providence, Rhode Island. And I think Sammy Harcum, who I believe lives in L.A. now. He's another good example. Also, there are folks who do slightly more traditional comics, such as Jordan Crane, who are still a part of this network of, I guess, what I'll call the Kramer's Ergot, family. But I feel like, there's been enough movement in the middle part of this last decade that now you're starting to see graphic novels really feel like they need, from a creator's standpoint, to come back and hit with all the writing skills up front as well. Like, one of the best books I've read this last year was Market Day by James Sturm. James Sturm is a very, very respected cartoonist. He's also one of the driving forces behind the Center for Cartoon Studies up in Vermont. But his new book, Market Day, came out, which is just so tightly wound and potent and just really efficient. And it's one of the first graphic novels I've read in a long time where literally every word was essential and was written basically with a love for the written word. That's something I feel like you don't see very often in comics, even for well-written books, is a love for the written word. John Porcellino, who does King Cat comics, he's another person who I feel like is very good. When he's on, he's on. He has incredibly potent sensibility with his words.
Yeah. Now Market Day it's a it would be like a short story. Like it's a pretty compact story,
yes.
and it takes the span of like a day.
Yeah.
Is what it covers, and and there really isn't a lot of dialogue or exposition in it. A lot of the story's just carried by the by the art, but there is I think some very potent storytelling there, and the fact that stands out, I think is telling. I mean, this actually reminds me of something else that I've noticed as I've been going through a lot of these comics, that some of the best comics over the past couple decades are memoir, where you feel like people are really drawing on powerful personal experiences. So like Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, or like Craig Thompson's Blankets, that kind of thing. Like I feel like there's a lot of creative energy comes from, and a lot of emotional power comes from the artist's own experiences. I haven't felt up until like the more recent period that people were doing equally good stuff that was fiction, and I found that interesting as well. And do you think there's like something about comics that is makes it especially well disposed to doing memoir, or is there just a lot of great memoir because that's what the people who are making comics have access to?
I think it's two different things. Number one, especially as somebody who's done plenty of autobiographical comics and sees their role, in my own life or whatever. From if kids start drawing when they're 3 or 4, whether or not somebody ever gets into doing visual art more seriously, whether or not somebody ever gets into writing stories, much less comics, we're very familiar with expressing our own experience through basically through the comics form. Like it's perfectly okay for all kids to make comics about, or to do illustrative work about their family and their day and their life as a way of communicating. So I feel like, sure, it's a lot easier to, in one sense, to dig in and have a pool of inspiration or a pool of subject matter that you have a very intimate relationship with, and you can build a story out of that, even if the story is just autobiographical. But yeah, I'd have to say I think that the autobiographical or the memoir style tale does come with a certain kind of ease and a certain kind of intimacy in the comics form that it's a lot more difficult to achieve just with a book, let's say. Also, I do know that the explosion in the last decade of graphic novels as autobio definitely is part of it's part of a movement in a generation of creators. You grow up being inspired by certain books. For example, the book that really showed me what a comic is capable of is I Never Liked You by Chester Brown, and which is a memoir. I assume it's probably a little fictionalized, but it's essentially an autobiographical comic about his teenage years. I don't know, I feel like at a certain point you move past whatever you feel your big autobiographical tale is. And you're ready for more. You're ready to finally, at a certain point you've exhausted the story or the 3 or 4 stories that you've been carrying around in your heart for years and years. And
so you kind of have to get those off your chest to move on to something else.
Which is also nice because, once you leave an autobiographical fold, at a certain point, you start to see that it's not just a phase. It's part of a cycle, part of a creative cycle. And, you're going to be interested in telling stories again about your own life. That it's not something you grow out of. It's simply something that has to be done, and it helps prepare you to write fiction if you're interested in writing fiction.
Tell me a little bit more about some of your influences as you were as you started making comics. So you started, you said you were 12. So I'm sure you had lots of different figures who you looked up to. In all of those years, you want to tell us who some of your sort of creative heroes were?
Okay. Well, basically, before I ever drew comics or anything, in the mid-'80s, I pretty much just, when I was a toddler, I read superhero books in the early '80s, and then in elementary school, I got, it was the Reagan era, I was really into G.I. Joe and Transformers and stuff, so I was reading a lot of war comics. And there was this book called The Nom that came out in the mid-'80s from Marvel, and the artist on that title is this guy Michael Golden, who's a established superhero artist. But I was about 8 years old when the book came out, and it was the first comic I ever saw where I was reading it, I was looking at the pages, and all of a sudden, it was very clear to me that there was a difference between this art and the other art I had seen in books. So once I started drawing comics, Michael Golden's art led me to this guy Arthur Adams, who remains he's my all-time favorite superhero artist, but he's also the reason I started drawing comics, period.
Yeah, one of my favorites as well, yeah.
Excellent. And a lot of the bigger Japanese comic artists from the late 80s, and so Masamune Shirow and Katsuhiro Otomo, they were really, really important to me. And Hayao Miyazaki, of course, but more for his animation than for his comics. But I grew up in Arkansas, so we had one comic book store in Little Rock, and you couldn't go too deep past the Dark Horse Comics, Image Comics realm of independence.
Yeah.
You just weren't going to find a whole lot. So once I moved away to New York and I was in school, then Chester Brown, Linda Berry, Dylan Horrocks, these are people who affected me a lot. And some of my classmates wound up definitely leaving a mark on me. But I honestly didn't spend a whole lot of time kicking it with them while I was in school, or really paying too much attention to anybody else's work, I have to admit. These days, my major influences as far as comics are the ones who really sort of pushed me, to change in the last few years. There's an Italian cartoonist, her name's Gabriella Giondelli, and she's been doing books for a long time, but Fantagraphics has 4 issues of the comic that she did called Interiore. That's the only thing that's in English that I can see. Gabriella Giondelli, Dash Shaw, I think, is, he's just in his mid-20s, but he's doing stuff that nobody's ever done with comics. And his first graphic novel, Love Eats Brains, blew my mind. What's
the name of that one? I have not looked up Dash Shaw yet.
Yeah, it's called Love Eats Brains, and came out in, I guess, 2004, maybe 2003. And a lot of the semiotic choices and a lot of the visual vocabulary he uses are similar to what he does in The Mother's Mouth and Goddess Head and some of those earlier books he did before Bottomless Belly Button. His stuff really blew my mind. I think in recent years I finally got into Jeff Smith's Bone, which a lot of people consider the best comic ever made. And that sort of, re-stoked the fire in me about traditional, fictional, or even fantastic storytelling.
And Jeff Smith has a very sort of traditional kind of animation style, of clean, almost Disney-looking cartooning.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's something I wanted to ask you about. There's one of the things that I found most interesting about your style is the fluidity of it in the sense that the style seems to change a little bit depending on the panel. So sometimes you'll be actually quite realistic in the way you render a face, but other times it will be very cartoony, button eyes and just a little scoop for a nose. And the thing is, I find that really, really effective. And one of the things that I've always struggled with trying to draw is that I have a penchant for just for realism or verisimilitude, but it doesn't work very well in a storytelling context. Somehow the more the more real something is rendered, somehow that pushes the reader out of it. That creates a space. That there's something about the abstraction of a cartoony style that invites the reader into it to fill in the details.
Oh, definitely.
And I wonder if you have I would love to hear any thoughts you have about why you make the stylistic choices you do along the sort of like cartoony, realistic dimension.
Well, I also came from, I feel like, it's not uncommon for folks who grew up reading visually representational superhero comics. You teach yourself to draw in a very representational and conservative way. And I feel like a lot of that is, I think things are different, both with the explosion in comics that's happened, but also in the influence of manga on American comics. But speaking for my own generation, I think that at a certain point, you start to focus really hard on getting a lot of that fluidity and a lot of the iconic power of drawing back. And basically, that takes years to feel a little bit more comfortable with. But then, a lot of it is, creating a canvas with sort of iconic, simplified representations of people at the right time that'll allow, just as you were saying, and as Scott McCloud has said many times, it'll allow people to imprint themselves on a certain character, a certain experience. In general, I'd say more than any, before I had like a language for what that was, I remember being affected a lot by The Secret of Nim, the that Don Bluth did the animation for, and then after that, a lot of Japanese cartoons I saw in the early 90s, where you have these incredibly lush, detailed, realistic backgrounds and environments with very simple cartoony characters, and yet you never once really paid attention to how cartoony and sometimes ridiculous looking the characters were. Because you were them at that moment. You were really focused on these trees and the spaceship and everything. Yeah. So, in general, I find that a lot of those situations where I'm flipping back and forth from a more representational depiction to a more cartoony depiction, I guess I'm sort of imagining the scene, I guess, in an animated form in my head, and it's, if something I'm focusing on is more environmental and it has to do with, flecks of grass floating in the air, a breeze coming up, and what that means to the person's hair, then I'm going to be focused a lot more on these elements. If it has more to do with the person's expression, depending on how tight it is that I imagine a shot being in my head. In general, once I pencil it out, all my pencils are really rough. So sometimes I'll do rough pencils of a face during a scene, and it might just have a few lines in it, and there are certain times where I realize, it's time to ink. I realize that it only needs those 10 lines I put in there. At other times, I'll surprise myself by realizing that it's turning into something that's very heavily shadowed, that's still not complicated, but the weight is very different. So I guess a lot of that decision-making, as far as just how representational form is, comes close to the last minute in the inking stage.
That's fascinating. Because one of the things that is really compelling about Swallow Me Whole is it's so incredibly emotionally evocative. Like, it has a sense of atmosphere to it that I think very few books achieve, and I think a lot of it has to do with those kinds of decisions about when to do the really realistic background that gives you a really strong sense of place, and when to do a cartoony figure where the thing that matters about the figure is maybe the body language or the posture. That everything that's being communicated is being communicated through just the way the figure's hunched or something like that. And it's not necessary. It's just you just don't need to do a lot with the face, right? Because it's not really conveying any information. But I feel like you just did that masterfully in this book, sort of moving back and forth between the realism and the cartoony in a way that gives it the weight of somehow hyper real in some places.
I think that is one of the hardest things to do successfully in a comic, is to listen to the part of you that is telling you don't need a lot of this information. It takes a long time, and it's something that I'm every single time I sit down and I'm just drawing and my mind is starting to drift away from what I'm doing, I realize that the telltale sign that I'm drifting, that I'm not focusing enough, is because I'm just arbitrarily including information that's not essential. It's different than just having noodly lines or whatever. It's basically riding the line between representational and iconic or iconographic. It's riding that line in an unsuccessful way, and I feel like the lines that I'm doing have only started to really clean themselves up as I was ending Swallow Me Whole, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've got it's rendered in this sort of lovely, lush, sort of brush style. Do you largely use a brush?
I use about 50-50. Basically,
about 50-50.
About 50% of my work is with a standard kind of crow quill pen nib. And my general method now is that I will do most of the contour work on the page, all with crow quill, and then I'll go back and I'll do all the black spaces with a nice number 2 watercolor brush, and then I'll go back again and do the gray areas with a combination of brush and the nib pen.
Nice. Let's talk a little bit about what it's like making comics, because it's a strange subculture, there's lots of conventions, and like you talked earlier about learning how to sell your self-published zine comics in comic shops. Can you just tell us a little bit about like what it's like trying to get your work out, trying to make money from it, what's hard about that, and what you've learned?
Oh, certainly. Basically, since 2000, I guess, I've been putting what I would consider like full-time energy into doing comics and thus publishing them and keeping the whole thing going. I've been going to conventions and events since about 2004. And for the last year and a half, I've been lucky enough to do comics full-time. And I'm just trying to keep that going. It's interesting because...
And is that because of the success of your last book you were able to devote all your time?
Actually, it's because I'm working on 2 graphic novels at the same time right now. One of them I'm doing the writing and drawing chores on. The other I'm just drawing. Someone else is writing it.
Yeah.
That book I'm getting paid to draw. And so it's because of that forthcoming book that I'm able to, it was a few months after Swallowing Whole came out, and some momentum was picking up there. And I sort of felt, this is obviously, the time where I need to take a chance and see if this can work. But basically, as far as independent comics goes, as a microcosmic, as a sub-scene as well as an economy, it's interesting because when I was strictly self-publishing and sending books out, sending my own comics out to distributors and everything, I was definitely, making enough money to print the next issue. But I was not keeping any of that money for myself. And that's the general experience on any level. Yeah. Even if you're not self-publishing, if you're, by putting out books on Top Shelf or Fantagraphics or whoever, unless a book is rather successful, it generally comes down to the joy of having your book, and you are able to make money, at your table at a comic convention when you're selling them. But a lot of expense goes back into hitting the road and going to these comic shows. Mm-hmm. What makes...
Well, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I think people see, clips about Comic-Con once a year, but I don't know if people know so much about the smaller convention scene.
Yeah, I mean,
what are those like?
Well, it really is a scene, yeah. And I mean that without any sort of value judgment. Actually, I guess I'm using that word because I grew up in the punk rock subculture, still very much a part of the punk subculture, but in my, attitude having early mid-20s, I always had the assumption that most other scenes and subcultures didn't have this certain spirit of cooperation and dedication, and even like an ethical or moral framework that would really tie things together. And once I started going to these independent comic shows, and a lot of them are in places like in the Hilton, somewhere in Ohio, and others are in much, much larger settings. But I really had no idea that just like a lot of like a band going on tour in the punk world, these shows are just made up of a couple hundred people all basically blowing their whole paycheck to get some table space, getting to see friends who they've met from other events, and they might see each other 2 times a year, 4 times a year, or whatever, splitting money on hotel rooms, working over the weekend on a book together, and then like staying up late at night, printing the book, distributing it. Most people getting rid of most of their books, even if it's all just for trade. It really blew my mind that the comic book community is in fact still based on a spirit of cooperation and a genuine interest in the creative endeavors of the people who make it. And so it's interesting, these, for example, SPX, the Small Press Expo, which is in Washington, D.C., it's in Maryland, right outside D.C. every year. This is my favorite show. Yes. Or yeah, now it's North Bethesda. It was in Rockville though.
Okay.
But I don't know. It's my favorite show in the United States all year. Maybe 5 or 10,000 people wind up coming to it. There are a couple 200 tables maybe. But you have folks who are going to fork out the bucks for their table. They might only sell a handful of books. And you have publishers like Fantagraphics and Drawing Quarterly and Top Shelf who are coming there, and you have a wide array of books for sale. A lot of full-time cartoonists are there, and a lot of people who just make mini comics for the love of it. But I don't know. It really, it's more than just to say that to an extent everybody's on the same level at these events, because I really feel that is in fact true. It's really nice to get to every once in a while, a couple times a year, go to an event which underlines or underscores the truth that regardless of whether or not you're able to do comics independently, everyone in the room is doing whatever they need to do or whatever they can do for the sake of the medium itself and for the sake of the stories that they want to tell.
Here's something that maybe you can. This seems closely related. Maybe you can comment on it. Is that it is? I don't think a lot of people, who aren't sort of into comics, understand that there is this subculture. That there are hundreds of people producing mini comics on photocopiers and going to these shows and selling them to each other, this just brings up, in my mind, the kind of the centrality of self-publishing in the comics world, and this is something that's been fascinating to me because, again, being here at Iowa, you just if you're doing fiction, you don't self-publish, right? That's gauche. But there seems to be no stigma whatsoever to self-publishing in comics. In fact, there's a kind of extra credibility you get for going through the sort of whole DIY process and the process of sort of getting it distributed yourself and being part of this hands-on community of people who just make cool stuff. Can you say something about the place of self-publishing in comics and why it's not so stigmatized as in other media?
Well, I think it does hold there is a special balance there, a special recognition. Mm-hmm. And I think that for the most part, it's simply that any of those established companies, established indies, started out in much the same way that I or that someone else has their own self-publishing imprint for their own books. And as a good example, my primary publisher, Top Shelf, which operates out of the Atlanta area, has had a lot of really successful books. They've done Blankets by Craig Thompson. They do most of Alan Moore's comics these days. But really to get down to the operations of their business and the way they relate to and with all the creators and the way that everyone, at a convention you got the publishers will come in and all the creators will come in, we'll be behind a couple of tables together, but everyone is manning every stage of the operation. We're restocking stuff, we're running credit cards, we're doing promotion work for other people's books, and it really allows you to see that, we're talking about a spectrum here in the independent publishing market or in the independent comic scene. Top Shelf, for example, I consider to be a very successful do-it-yourself comic book company. I guess much like Discord Records would be in a musical sense, that remains completely independent, but is able to have a lot of good hype and a lot of good creators attached to it, and definitely keeps itself afloat. So I'd say that there is certainly an acknowledgement in general that there really isn't a whole lot that separates a more successful, true independent comic publisher from somebody who's putting out their own books twice a year, 3 times a year, on their own imprint.
Now, this is something that's kind of fascinated me, is this kind of creator series that you know, a lot of the sort of big graphic novels that come out are sort of serialized in advance in the creator's own vehicle. So like Chris Ware does the Acme Novelty Company, or Dan Clowes does his, you know, what is it, Speedball or 8-Ball or whatever. Yeah, you know, is that generally that kind of serialization? Is that a way to just kind of keep kicking the can down the road in order to finance a larger work? Because usually there's this bigger story that's, you know, serialized in this thing that comes out a few times a year maybe, and there's always some extra stuff in that makes it just not redundant with the future graphic novel. Can you tell us something about the sort of the rationale behind that phenomenon?
Well, in general, I'd actually say, you know, the opposite is true. For the most part, serialized issues are a money pit. And a lot of that, you know, a lot of the times, individual issues, you know, and people who do serialized comics are doing that because we love the serialized form, or they love the serialized form. And it's only going to be a handful of creators who are really well established. For example, Dan Clowes and Adrian Tomine, who does Optic Nerve. You know, these are two folks who can successfully, I'll just go ahead and say, they can break even at least doing doing serialized issues. But because of the changes that have, and this has not always been the case, I think they've only turned into a money pit in this previous decade. And a lot of this has to do with changes not only in the comic book direct market, but more importantly, the changes in the book market as far as their receptivity to graphic novels as a form. Thus, it's made it so that if a book has a spine, it's a lot more likely to be sustainable, because you're going to be getting half your orders through places like Barnes & Noble and Borders. But still, these individual issues, you know, like, basically we're in a new era of the graphic novel, and so there is a special thrill that comes with, you know, there's thrill and there's respect for folks who stick by their serialized guns. And there are a lot of independent publishers, one's called Spark Plug Books. This guy Dylan runs it, and has some really great serialized comics that, you know, come out 3 times a year, twice a year. And in general, you can tell it's a labor of love, but it's very exciting that certain publishers are able to actually stay afloat, largely doing single-issue books. I really have no idea how that's possible. But yeah, it's definitely a sign of not only changing markets, but these two parallel markets, you know, trying to resolve their own problems. You know, the comic book market and what's happened with it, and then the book market and the way that's influenced the final product of the comic book.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. Well, before we wrap it up, can you tell us a little something about the projects that you're working on now,
Sure.
and what we can look forward to?
Yeah. Well, I'm working on a book called Any Empire, which is going to come out in the fall of 2011, and that's for Top Shelf. It's basically a book that follows 3 kids who live in a town together, and it follows them from being kids in the Reagan era and their relationship to this very specific kind of like privileged Reagan era fantasy about violence, like growing up in, you know, a Reagan and G.I. Joe era. And follows them through adulthood as their relationship with violence changes, and as they try to resolve some of the issues that they grew up with surrounding violence and its role in the world. So there's that book, and then I'm drawing a book called The Silence of Our Friends, which First Second Books is putting out in early 2012. And that's written by Mark Long and Jim Demonakos. And basically that takes place in 1968 in Houston, Texas, and it follows the families of a white TV reporter for the Houston News and a black radical professor at Texas State University. And the unlikely friendship that emerges as their both sort of fighting for the same social causes, but they find themselves in basically, some heated situations in which they're essentially using each other's friendship to further their own means without even realizing it. So those are the two main books I'm working on. I'm doing a bunch of other stuff on the side.
When are they slated to hit the stands?
Any Empire should be out in the fall of 2011, and The Silence of Our Friends will be out in February of 2012.
Cool. I asked my Twitter followers what I should ask you, and I got very little response because my Twitter followers are politics people and comic book people. But I got one of my politics followers who, and a close friend of mine, wanted me to ask you. He doesn't get comics. He just he understands that it's something that educated, literate people are interested in, but he just doesn't get it. And so, can you say something about why you think comics are hard to penetrate for some people, and then also for people out there who don't read comics or look at the sort of indie graphic novels? Maybe you can say something about what they might not understand that they're missing.
Okay. Well, yeah. First off, that's not an uncommon thing at all. And some of it is generational. Some of it simply has to do with diving into the world of comics at a certain point. And a lot of it's because comics, it sounds like a cliche now, but it's just true that comics is a language and a form of its own. Mm-hmm. And especially as the form and the means of communicating through comics is advancing, that means the language is becoming, stranger and stranger and less accessible from people who are coming strictly from the written word or from imagery. So, oftentimes you have people who are born before a certain year who simply don't have regular access to these changes in the semiotic structure that's or the semiotic form that's available in comics. And I mean.
Yeah, my fiance, when I gave her a couple, I gave her Asterios Polyp or something to read, and and she was like, "How do you know which panel to look at next?"
Right.
And how do you know? I mean, it's there's a bunch of conventions that you have to kind of be hep to if you're going to be able to parse the thing.
Yeah, that's a heavy duty bite to chew off. There is jumping right into Asterios Polyp. Basically,
well, I wanted to convince her that there was substance.
Oh yeah, of course. And it's been said a million times, but once a year I sit down and I reread Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Mm-hmm. It's always informative, refreshing. It gets me re-excited about drawing comics and things I could do with it. But for anybody, especially in such a media-saturated culture, and a culture that uses multimedia so regularly now, this book, it remains not just prophetic. It's practically an institution. Yeah. But as far as defining the language of comics in a way that's approachable and cool and extremely insightful, I would just do the usual thing now, and I would start with Understanding Comics, and the form will come a lot more naturally.
Yeah, I agree. I don't agree with everything in the book, but it makes you think about it in a way that you never would have.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think our time's about up, Nate. Thanks for coming on. This is Nate Powell. Here's his book, Swallow Me Whole, an Eisner and Ignatz Award winner. I encourage you all to check it out to see what's going on in quality graphic literature these days. Thanks, Nate.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Cool. Take care.